Just give me a second. And remember, the points cam is going to go off sometime during the lecture. All right, and your points are based on largely on how many times we catch you with your camera on. So get that on, because the grading period's coming to a close. All right. So Louis XIV, not a stranger to you anymore after yesterday's video, but let's go into it a little more globally. So we're leaving behind now that shared power model, whether it's the parliament and the king, or the republic, or a Greek leader and the citizens voting, to the complete opposite, absolutism. There's one leader, the king. Sometimes it's a queen, but mostly it's a king, and they are absolutely in charge. All right. And so this part's pretty easy. All right. An absolute monarch has absolute power. And there are a lot of demands that makes on you. There's a lot of conditions you have to fulfill to hope to have that absolute power. The theory behind it, well, there's two theories. But the main theory, before a guy we're going to meet next week named Thomas Hobbes, the main theory is the one we talked about last week with James I. And that is that kings have absolute power because God kinged them. He made them king. And so they only answer to God. They don't answer to a parliament. They don't answer to citizens. They don't answer to a court. They only answer to God. And here you can see this depiction. Here we see Louis XIV receiving the crown from an angel to signify that he is God's choice to be King of France. This coincides with a period of a couple hundred years where kings are becoming more powerful in Europe. The Black Death, which thankfully our current pandemic is nowhere near as deadly, but the Black Death went through Europe in the 15th century, and it killed close to half the people. About 40% of the people died. And this, to summarize, it brought an end to that old feudal system of serfs and knights and lords, and everything was very, very local. All politics was really local. The changes brought about by the massive death led to emigration to cities. People stopped farming. The demand for farming goods dropped. And so the feudalist system declined. And that gave more power to kings. Another thing that happened, which is beyond the scope of this class, and that is that the Roman Catholic Church split into Catholics and Protestants. And so this weakened the church's power in Europe, and that power vacuum was taken up in large part by kings, especially in Western Europe, especially in places like France and Spain and Britain. So we have the end of feudalism, which ends the power of the local nobility, the rise of towns and cities who are loyal to a king and who pay taxes to a king, and then a decline in church authority. So we're getting stronger monarchies until we're going to get absolute monarchies. And in a lot of cases, there will be a lot of crises and problems and wars and famines that will lead people to give more and more power to one charismatic leader. And our guy Hobbes, that we're going to look at next week, he will talk about this. But time and time again, people who've experienced chaos and fear and uncertainty, they'll trade away their freedom to someone who can give them order, who can end the chaos. And that's what these absolute monarchs promise. And so before we get to Louis, we got to go back a little bit and look at his grandfather and his father. Part of the chaos of 17th century Europe was religious wars. I told you Protestantism had happened, and we're going to spend the better part of a century and a half fighting wars over will regions be Protestant or Catholic, or if Protestant, what kind of Protestant. The worst of them was the 30 Years' War, which killed, between the war and starvation, just tens of millions of people. But there's civil wars too. There's a religious war within France. There's a religious war within Germany. The religious war within France ends when Henry of Navarre, a Protestant noble, becomes king of France. And he decides to bring about peace, that he will reconvert and become Catholic again, because he recognizes that 90% of the people in France are Catholic, and he's going to be their king. So he converts to Catholicism and becomes king, and he establishes the line of Bourbons, or Bourbon. This is the family that's going to rule France all the way up through the French Revolution and beyond. And he will be the first Bourbon monarch. And he's going to try to end the religious war by issuing an edict. This is something kings can do. It has the force of law because the king has the power to do it. Excuse me. And so he'll issue the Edict of Nantes. Nantes is a place. It's a town where he makes the edict. And that declares that Protestant areas of France are free to be Protestant, and Catholic areas of France will remain Catholic. It's not a total grant of religious freedom. If you're a Protestant, you're only allowed to be Protestant in your Protestant town. Okay, you can't worship wherever you want. But it does protect Protestants in the areas that they controlled as of the edict. And that was still too much toleration for some people, because he, like his predecessor, Henry III, is assassinated by a fanatical Catholic who doesn't want any peace with Protestants in France at all. So Henry III is assassinated, Henry IV is assassinated, and then Henry's son Louis becomes the king, Louis XIII. And he becomes king when he's around your age, maybe a year younger even. And so he doesn't know a lot about kinging. And so he needs someone to help him run the country. And that person is called a regent. And his regent is the Cardinal Richelieu, Jean-Normand Duplessis. And he really is much more involved in politics than in religion. He's a shrewd politician, very effective, and runs France very ably. And in fact, so well that Louis XIII basically says, you know what? You handle it. You run France. I'll be king, and I'll go to the parties and wear the short pants. And so Richelieu rules completely, and he's going to basically work to increase the power of the king. He's going to limit the freedom of French Protestants, who are called Huguenots. You see that down there? You won't have to know that for a test. But French Protestants are called Huguenots, and he restricts their freedom to move around in France. And also, he's really big on restricting the nobility. Remember the Star Chamber back in England? Well, Richelieu doesn't have a Star Chamber, but he arrests and tries and tortures nobles who he can convict of rebelling against the king. He'll knock down their castles so that they can't defend themselves against the king's army. He's gradually breaking down the power of the nobility to strengthen the Bourbon monarchs. And so guess what? The nobles hate him. And they're going to hate his successor, too, after Louis dies. But we'll put a pin in that for a minute. To talk about this intellectual movement, because that's really this whole unit. We're talking about religion and politics and absolutism right now. But the name of this overall unit is called a revolution in thought. People are going to start to think differently. And they're going to start to think much more the way that we recognize now and that we teach you in school. And one of the things about that is skepticism. And that's an attitude of, when we say skeptical, we mean, you're not just going to accept what I say. You're going to need a little evidence or a little proof or a little logic. Well, a true skeptic believes there is no absolute truth. Nothing can be known for absolute certain. And so they're skeptical. And they say we can get close to the truth, but it takes a lot of mental legwork. And there's two figures who I'm sure that you will be huge fans of when you find out what they invented. The first is Michel de Montaigne. Now in France, Michel is Michael, so he's a guy, not a girl. And he explores the meaning of life and how close can he get to truth in things like education, love, marriage, crime and punishment, faith. He writes a whole series of things that he invents called essays. So Michel de Montaigne invented the essay. And I know you guys love writing essays. So, say a little thanks to Michel de Montaigne for writing the essay. Even more influential, and we'll talk more about him next week, is this guy, René Descartes. René Descartes is going to observe the world around him and create a whole new philosophy, again, that we'll talk about more next week. But he also realizes, he was a soldier in the 30 Years' War, and he's just camped around the fire one night during the war, and he realizes that every algebraic expression has a graphic equivalent. So he invents analytical geometry, and I know you guys love that, right? We wouldn't need graphing calculators if it wasn't for Descartes. All right, so two very important intellectual titans for current education. Back to politics. So Louis XIII dies, normal old man death, but young. And then his son Louis comes to power. And Louis XIV is going to be the most powerful ruler in French history. He's going to be king for 72 years. That's just not the length of his life. That's how long he's king for. And his son and his grandson will die waiting for their turn to be king. And when he does eventually die, his great-grandson will become Louis XV, who was a terrible king, but you don't have to learn about him. So he's going to become the most absolute of the absolute rulers. And it starts when he's 5 years old. He becomes king when he's 5. All right, so we have another one of these regency things. And his regent who runs things is another French cardinal named Mazarin. So another French officer of the church. And the nobles take all their hatred of Richelieu and combine it and project it onto Mazarin, and they rebel. They're like, look, the king's only 5 years old. We don't know if this Cardinal Mazarin is as good as Richelieu was. And so we get a rebellion, an open rebellion of the nobles against the king, trying to get back some of that power they had lost. And this is called, to history, the Fronde. And this takes its name from, in the streets of Paris, there were these dirty little boys who would use slingshots to fling poo and dirt at people, and they were called frondeurs. And so they are comparing the rebellious nobles to the little dirty street boys. So it's called the Fronde. But this was a very traumatic time, especially for Louis. Think back to when you were 6 years old, sleeping in your bedroom, and a bunch of people crash into your bedroom and kidnap you and hold you for ransom. Okay, so he'd been kidnapped, held for ransom, all sorts of things when he was really young. And that made him very intent that as soon as possible, he would have all the power, not share it with a regent, not share it with the nobles. And so when he takes power in 1661, he lets Mazarin go back to being a cardinal, and he announces that he's going to rule completely on his own. He's not going to have a chief advisor. He's going to have a bunch of advisors, but he's calling the shots. And one of the major things he does that's going to have an impact on France for a long time is he changes the way France is administered. Okay, France back then was broken up into provinces. And sort of like we have states, they have provinces. And for each province or province, he would appoint a leader for that province, and they would be called an intendant or intendant, right? That's where we get, like, now the person in charge of our schools is the superintendent, all right? So this is where that word comes from. And they owe their job totally to Louis. He hired him, he'll fire him. And their job is to go to Languedoc or Orléans or Normandy or some region and to collect Louis's money, get my money, and do what I tell you. And so Louis has these intendants collecting taxes and running things. That means that the local nobles don't have as much power, and these intendants have to do exactly what Louis says, or they'll lose their job, if not their head. And so that increases his power across the country. Now, one of the key things of being an absolutist, this is what Charles I couldn't do back in England. If you're not going to share power, you got to pay for everything. And so Louis is intent on raising enough money to be able to pay for the whole government and never go to the nobles and ask for money. And the main person who's going to help him in this is his economic advisor, Jean-Baptiste Colbert. And he's going to turn France basically into sort of what we think of China as today, an exporter, right? He wants basically everything that, not everything, that's an overstatement, but as much as possible that the stuff other Europeans buy comes from France. That's what exporting is. So they're going to export guns and iron ore and fancy things like lace and mirrors and fine china and all of this stuff they're going to be exporting because they want the other countries buying the goods and they want the money flowing into France. And so Colbert will do an amazing job growing the French economy. It will become by far the dominant economy in the 18th century. Unfortunately, Colbert built a house that Louis thought was a little too nice and like almost in some ways nicer than his palace. So he fired Colbert and never spoke to him again for having the nerve, I guess, to build a house nicer than the king's. And then in 1685, Louis comes to this conclusion, which to him is very logical. He thinks he's king because of who? God, right? So God made me king. So I owe God some things. Now, Louis also, remember, he says, l'état c'est moi. The state is me. I am France. And so Louis engages in what we call a logical syllogism, which you'll learn about if you take logic in college. And that is, he says, I am France. I am Catholic. Therefore, France must be Catholic. Okay, do you see that logical sequence there? And so he says, if he is truly France, then there can only be Catholics in France. Plus, he feels he owes it to God to kick the Protestants out of France. So he rejects the Edict of Nantes, and he tells the Huguenots, the French Protestants, you can either quit being Protestant or you can quit being French. You have those two choices. And many, many Huguenots leave France and go to the Netherlands and go to the Americas. And that represents a big loss of wealth for Louis, because most of these Huguenots are middle class, upper middle class people with lots of money and expertise. And they leave rather than switch religions. But now France is completely unified under Louis as a singularly Catholic country. Now we'll get into what they talked about a lot in the video yesterday, and that is just his general way of being, his cult of personality is what we call it now. And remember yesterday's warm-up, right? He's influential, he's famous, he's rich, he's all of those things. And he works hard to stay famous, rich, and influential. Okay, you saw that, every meal is a feast. Every part of the day is very scripted out, right? It's all planned, and there's a whole social hierarchy of, who gets to sit with the king, who gets to eat with the king, who does what. I mean, there are a group of, I can't remember the number, but the most special people of the day got to watch the king get up out of bed and get dressed. That was a huge honor. Watch him put his clothes on. All right, so there's all this stuff going on. And the reason it's going on is because Louis wants to control the nobles. So he agrees with many of you. He wants his house to be big enough to hold his family and his friends, and not even just that, but his potential enemies as well. Okay? He forces the nobles to spend much of the year at his palace. And they have to pay rent while they're there, and they have to pay for all these very expensive clothes and outfits in order to keep up appearances for the court. And he keeps them there right in front of him so they can't plot against him. All right, that's how he keeps control of them, is they have to stay with him at Versailles. And Versailles is his palace. And it's the most famous palace probably in the history of Europe. It is about 20 kilometers outside of Paris. It used to be just a hunting lodge that his dad Louis XIII built in order to have quality time away from Louis's mom. But then Louis expands it, and it becomes the grandest palace of Europe. And I'll show you just one part of it. The most famous exterior part is the gardens. The most famous interior part is this, the Hall of Mirrors. Right? And so this is a photograph. This is what it's been restored to today. So mirrors were an extreme luxury. Most people didn't own a mirror. Okay? You didn't know what you would look like. You'd have to go look in a pond or a barrel of rainwater. But this whole hall, this whole wall over here, that I'm moving the red dot around, that's completely lined with mirrors. And the other side is all windows. So the sunlight comes in the windows, shines off the mirrors, and it becomes incredibly bright and lit up in there, which Louis sees himself as what? What does he like to be called? The Sun King. So that's the Hall of Mirrors. He'd go through there. After the honored people got to see him put his clothes on, he'd walk through the Hall of Mirrors, and the rest of the nobility would line that hall and wait. And most people, Louis, would just walk by. But you had to say, "Good morning, Your Majesty." And he ignored most people. If he made eye contact with you, that was good. That meant that Louis liked you. If he nodded at you, like, "What's up, dude?" If he gave you one of those, that was even better. And if he stopped and talked to you, you were the bomb. You were really in his inner circle. So there's all these kind of behaviors that are designed to take up all this time and keep the nobles busy so they can't plot against him. And a big palace is going to have a lot of art in it. Louis is going to be a patron. That means pay for. Lots and lots of art. And France becomes the cultural center of Europe. I'll talk more about that at the end with legacy. But essentially, everyone's looking at France. What are they doing at Versailles? That's what we want to do. And so the fashion, the behaviors, the dances, the music, the art is all setting trends for the rest of Europe. And Louis, of course, makes sure that most of the artistic output directly glorifies him. Right? He's the Sun King. He's the center of all warmth and goodness in the universe. And so he wants the art to reflect that. That's what we call a cult of personality. We'll see that later with lots of other leaders, like Hitler and Mussolini and Stalin. Basically creating an image, okay? It's selling a brand. That's what we would call it now. And so we get to the second half of the 17th century with France being the political and cultural center of Europe. And then Louis is going to embark on a long, long series of wars, which are expensive. Wars are the most expensive thing a country can do. And Louis is going to be drawn into war to try and expand his kingdom. The first war he's in, you don't have to know these wars separately, but the Spanish Netherlands, which are nowhere near Spain, I'll show you the map in a minute. They're northeast of France. His wife has a legitimate claim to these lands, and other people don't want him to add those lands to France. So he starts a war there. It's called the War of Devolution. But then that leads into a much bigger war when the rest of Europe realizes that Louis is terrifying. He's so wealthy and has so much power that they all take turns uniting against him. Okay, much like, you know how the Avengers, like someone would fight Thanos and then they'd get exhausted and some more would come in and they'd get exhausted, right? So think of Louis as Thanos, and then this League of Augsburg are the Avengers taking turns wearing him down because no one country can beat him by themselves. So we get the League of Augsburg, and they're going to fight him for 9 years in the 9 Years' War. Meanwhile, France is gradually weakening. They're having poor harvests, which means less food to eat and to sell. The peasants are the most highly taxed people in the world. And France is slowly starting to decline, but it's very, very slow. None of this keeps Louis from fighting all of Europe single-handedly for quite a long time. So here's Europe in 1700. But here's France. These are the territories, some of these territories here in the Spanish Netherlands, that he should have inherited through his wife, Anne of Austria. And so they get into a fight about this, and then the League of Augsburg, it's Britain, it's Sweden, it's the Habsburg Empire, it's some of the Italian states. They all take turns holding Louis in check. And then they sign a big peace treaty, which then is going to be upended because we're going to fast forward to 1701, and the King of Spain, whose name was Charles XII, you don't have to know about him. He's called Charles the Sufferer because he never had children, and his family tree pretty much looks like a pencil, okay? So a lot of inbreeding in his family, a lot of genetic diseases. He has a very sad life and dies without heirs, and all the great powers had organized on who they're going to give the throne of Spain to since he doesn't have kids. Well, on his deathbed, he upsets everything by saying that he's going to leave the Spanish throne to Louis's nephew. And Louis immediately sends a big army into Spain and recognizes his own nephew as King of Spain. And that starts really what some historians look at really as the First World War. All right, Europeans, they have colonies, they're all over the place. There's fighting all over the place. You can look at it that this is World War I, and World War I, what we call World War I, is actually World War VII, and World War II is World War VIII. But you can totally ignore that too. But this is a huge, huge war, is my point. And again, the same powers that were in the League of Augsburg just keep, substituting players and keeping up the war against Louis, because they're afraid that if Louis wins, let me go back up, he will eventually unite the crowns, and France and Spain will become one giant country, be called Frane or Spance. He couldn't decide. No, but they were afraid that there'd be one giant empire. And so they will do whatever they can to prevent that from happening until everybody's completely exhausted from fighting wars. And in 1714, Louis wins. He agrees to stop fighting, and the powers of Europe agree that his nephew can become the king of Spain. But Louis promises that he'll never unite the two crowns and make one country or one giant kingdom. And he keeps that promise. So from now on, you'll have the Bourbon family in charge in France and the other Bourbon family, their relatives, in charge in Spain. And we'll get a very short time of peace to get ready for the next round of wars. So, as we always do, let's end with legacy and his death. He's very old when he dies. He dies just a few years after the War of Spanish Succession. And like I said before, his son and grandsons had died waiting for him to die. And so when he dies, his great-grandson, Louis XV, will become king. And he's a terrible king, but you don't have to learn about him. He just accelerates all the bad stuff. But during Louis's rule, France, like I said, is the center of Europe. When you travel through different parts of Europe, you're going to see a lot of palaces that look like Versailles because they copied it. Right? You're going to see the fashions, the art. He had his own art style called Rococo or Rococo, and that's what everyone was copying, that super ornate style that you saw in the Hall of Mirrors. So France was the deal. French became the international language, replacing Latin. French became the international language of science. All the wealthy people, didn't matter if you were German, Russian, Italian, British, you were sending your kids to school to learn what? French, because all the nice, important people were speaking French. So it becomes really the cultural dominator of Europe. But his administration left France with heavy, heavy debts that France is never really going to be able to pay off because Louis XV is going to be worse than Louis XIV, and Louis XVI will be even worse than Louis XV. And then this huge debt is going to create a problem that blows up the whole country in our next unit, which is called the French Revolution. All right, so that's absolutism in France. On Thursday, we're going to switch over to Russia, where absolutism hangs on a lot longer, but not as influential as French absolutism. So let's go over here. And what you got? All right, so here are the notes, if you want to look at the notes. Here is the textbook section that you need to do the guided reading. All right. And so there's Richelieu. And there's Louis XIV, right? 5'5", but he wore high heels. And his grand style. And then here is, I hope if you're interested in Versailles, this quick page will tell you a lot about it. In 2003, when your textbook was published, so it's, what, a year older than you? It cost $2.5 billion to build in 2003 dollars. So that puts it more expensive than the Raiders' new stadium, but less than SoFi Stadium in LA. It took 36,000 workers to build it. There were 6,000 horses to haul the heavy stuff. And then once it was done, it is absolutely mammoth. Okay. Here's the palace itself. Here are the gardens, which are still there. All right. There's an artificial lake that he had put in there. I mean, it's, you know, it's like a huge casino and resort. There were, I don't see the number on here. Oh, 1,400 fountains. And nowhere in the world of that time could you get enough water pressure to run 1,400 fountains all at once. So there was one guy whose job it was just to keep an eye on the king. And when he was heading to another part of the palace, turn all the fountains on there and turn them off where he left. So to the king, it looked like the fountains were always on. Right? So that's the kind of stuff that's going on there if you're interested in it. And hopefully you are, because you have guided reading to do. So you'll click through. Right? And you'll sign into PowerSchool with your Google. And we'll start this attempt. And as you're reading, you'll see, and this was also in this, King Henry IV declared that France's blank could live in peace within their own cities in the Edict of Nantes. Now, there's two different ways to say that. There's the French, Huguenot, which I already typed it in here, so. Or they're also just French Protestants, so we have both answers in there. So you can say Huguenot or Protestants. So you keep working your way down. There are 16 of these guided reading questions. Get this done. And if you haven't done Prologue Section 3 guided reading in Power School, do that. Okay, grades are closing this week, and we want to get those scores in there. All right. So do that, do the guided reading, and that should set you up for today. Okay, if you have any questions, or if you want to make up the test, hang out. Otherwise, peace.
There's no events that can